He hadn't planned to dig up the past. He just wanted water. The drought had eaten his land raw. The bank was circling, and Caleb Harlan, a war-torn ranger who hadn't slept a full night in years, had one last gamble left. The ancient Termite Mound. Everyone in Lincoln County avoided. Locals whispered it was older than the ranch itself, that it hummed on windless nights. Caleb didn't care. He wanted a spring, not ghost stories. When the bulldozer's blade hit the mound, the desert shook. The ground didn't crack, it pulsed. Ranger, his therapy dog trained to pull him from panic attacks, went berserk. He lunged between steel and clay, growling like he'd seen the devil himself. Dust spiraled upward, as if the earth exhaled something buried too long. Caleb shut the machine off, heartbeat pounding in his ears. Ranger wouldn't stop digging. His claws struck metal. Beneath the hardened crust, a round hatch gleamed through rust, stamped Project Eclipse. 1965. The air that leaked out wasn't just cold, it vibrated, like a hum you could feel in your bones. Caleb's dog whimpered and backed away, eyes fixed on the dark soil that now thumped from beneath, slow and rhythmic, as if something down there had heard them. By nightfall, headlights appeared on the ridge, 2 black SUVs. Engines off, watching his house with no lights on. One man stepped out, said Caleb's father's full name, like it was a password. That's when Caleb realized his father hadn't died of a heart attack, and Ranger hadn't been protecting him. He'd been warning him. Wind burned the porch railings into splinters and carried the smell of dust, like an old threat. Caleb Harlan, early 50s, an Army Ranger who carried PTSD like shrapnel under skin, stood in the doorway with a cold mug and a hot letter, reading sentences that reduced a lifetime to a balanced due. Marlene Voss thanked him for his long relationship with the institution, and reminded him of the date by which further action would proceed. Lines at the corners of his mouth told of desert years. A silver thread ran through his beard. Posture remained straight, despite nights without rest. He put the letter back in its envelope, slid it into the drawer beneath the cutlery, as if burying the words could slow them. Ranger's nails clicked on the floorboards. The German Shepherd, rescued from the Alamogordo shelter and trained as a PTSD service dog, nudged his hip and looked up with amber certainty that steadied him better than any pill. 7 years old, the dog knew Caleb's storms, the stiffening shoulders, the eyelid twitch, the breath that forgot how to arrive. He stepped onto the porch, heat pressed through his shirt, though morning had barely begun. Far across the flats, cattle planted hooves around empty troughs, lifted tongues at dust, and moved off without complaint. The cottonwood by the barn rattled its dry leaves. Beyond it rose the mound. From any distance it resembled fused clay, a whale back the land had grown, and refused to shed. Up close it felt like a sealed door. Even lizards avoided pausing on its skin at noon. Caleb had studied it for years and never found a seam, yet he felt water sleeping below it the way a man can feel a storm before the radio bothers to confirm. Lincoln County called it a petrified anomaly, because no other label stuck. Teenagers dared each other to camp there, and left at midnight swearing it hummed. A geologist tapped it, frowned and said the sound was wrong. Caleb ignored speculation except for his father's lesson. Listen for what the ground refuses to say. When he placed his palm on the surface, coolness gathered under heat like hidden water. Belief hardened into a plan. He traced the fence line with Ranger shadowing him. His silver-streaked hair caught the light, and kind blue eyes kept their softness. War had not burned that away. He moved with the economy of a man who measured pain against purpose, and chose purpose every time. The shaking hands that visited during thunder had cost him nothing on the field, and everything after. He did chores by sequence because sequence gave sleep a chance. Check troughs, mend hinge, count cattle, run pump, note silent. At the barn he lifted the tarp from the bulldozer, and looked at the machine as if it were a reluctant partner. He would need diesel, hydraulic fluid, and a plan both insane and reasonable. He had one: destroy the mound, and find the spring. He felt in his bones. The windmill would drink again. The pasture would take a second breath. The bank would receive its check with Marlene's name. He pulled a wrench, crawled under the belly, tightened clamps, traced lines for leaks, and listened to the metal's blunt honesty. Steel did not flatter, lie or pity. It either worked or it didn't. A horn sounded on the road. Hank Greer turned through the gate, hand dangling from the wheel like he was negotiating with air. He parked and climbed down, squinting under the... "You look like a man about to marry a bad idea," he said. Caleb smiled with half his mouth. "You brought a blessing?" Hank toed the edge of the mound. "My grandpa tried to blast it in '72, didn't scratch it. He let that set, blew the cap off a well a mile away, and still didn't nick this." Caleb ran his palm over the surface. It shed heat, the way a river stone does after sunset, holding a chill that contradicted the air. "I don't need it to crack," he said. "I need the ground below to Hank's eyes softened. "I know what the bank sent. You sure about this?" "I'm sure enough," Caleb answered. Hank spat into dust, then grinned without joy. "Call if you need a tow," he said, and drove off. After Hank left, Caleb walked the perimeter of his problem. He marked a path between mesquite, counted steps, pictured the blade's angle, calculated lever and mass. He imagined the first bite, the shudder, the way the machine would skate and search for perch. Ranger trotted ahead, then returned leaning against his leg to pull him from a drift of thought. "I'm here," Caleb said, and believed it. Above them a hawk hung as if pinned to sky. Back inside, he spread bills across the table and did arithmetic with a carpenter's pencil. The hay rake would sell. The baler might. If it consented to start, he could part with the tooled saddle and keep his father's bit. He totaled numbers twice, then stared at the difference like a crater in the kitchen floor. To close it, he required water and time. Time was gone. He took the letter out again. Marlene's signature stretched like a ribbon along the bottom. He pictured her office and imagined asking for patience. He heard her voice already. Policy, guidelines, timeline. He folded the page and put it away. Evening approached. Heat loosened its grip and left creosote behind. Caleb loaded the cooler with water, added 2 jugs for the dog, tossed the tow chain, checked the first aid box, then slid the therapist's kit onto the seat. Lavender oil, mints, a rubber ring, and a card with 4 lines. Slow breath, find ground. Name 5 sounds. Call back. They drove to the rise. The truck rattled over washboard and stopped in the narrow shade of mesquite. Ranger leaped out, circled once, then jumped into the cab and settled with his chin on the window like a sentry. Caleb angled the dozer so the blade faced the highest point, then walked a circuit one last time, looking for any sign that the earth wanted to bleed. A darker seam, a patch that drank light. Nothing offered a truth. He let the land speak in small noises, a grasshopper's click, far traffic sliding along road, the windmill's squeak. He pictured the place green again, calves nosing water, a different letter arriving at a different desk, because a man refused to be timed out by drought. He climbed onto the cat and set his palms on the wheel, feeling the machine like a heartbeat outside his chest. He glanced toward the house where 2 windows held the day's last light, then toward the ridge where Hank had gone. He looked at Ranger, whose ears lifted at his neck. The sun lowered until the sky went a color of dried blood, rubbed thin over gold. Shadows pulled long, stitching field to horizon. Caleb turned the key. The diesel coughed, rattled, then settled into a steady growl that lived in his ribs. He eased the throttle forward. The track bit dust and rolled. Ranger watched from the truck, paws braced on the sill, eyes locked on the moving blade. The bulldozer advanced, and the day ended with the horizon burning blood orange, while steel crawled toward the mound. The blade screamed across the mound and sent a shiver through Caleb's ribs. He adjusted his angle and pushed again, letting the bulldozer's weight ride the clay. Sparks shredded out from the edge and winked away on the wind. The strange hill refused to lose even an inch. The tracks clawed forward. The machine growled. The ground stayed stubborn, like metal buried beneath metal. Heat radiated from the engine. Dust braided off the blade in thin veils, then dropped straight down as if the air were refusing to move. He tried a side bite, shaving at the shoulder to find weakness. The steel sang and skated, carving a shiny scar that immediately dulled. The gauge climbed. The smell of hot oil joined the reek of baked earth. Across the cab glass, he saw the truck. Ranger stood on the seat, rigid, ears speared forward, eyes threaded to the moving blade. Caleb lifted, breathed, lowered, and rammed one more time with every ounce of practical stubbornness that had kept the ranch stitched together this long. Nothing gave. Ranger barked, a single crack like a sapling snapping. Then the dog launched from the truck and sprinted straight for the mound. Caleb swore and cut the throttle. The engine fell silent with a final rasp, leaving the desert's quiet so loud it hummed. The windmill that had squeaked all afternoon stopped mid-note. Ranger scrambled up the slope and began to dig at a spot no bigger than a hand. He didn't test around. He didn't sniff in circles. He went after that one oval with ferocious precision. Caleb climbed down, boots sliding in the loosening grit. Back, Ranger. The shepherd ignored him and clawed faster. Grit arced behind paws. Nails clicked against something that answered with a muffled ring. Not stone, metal. Caleb dropped to his knees and cleared dirt in double handfuls. The top crust crumbled like old pottery. Beneath it, hard pan clung to the thing buried there. He fetched a spade, cut a crescent, and brushed away rust flakes, until a rim showed itself, round and unmistakably manufactured. Embossed letters surfaced under his sleeve. Project Eclipse. Below the name sat a date, 1965. Under that, a warning, UN, authorized entry prohibited. He traced the circle and found a recessed handle, gummed in clay. Ranger flattened, nose inches from the seam, chest heaving, eyes locked as if awaiting a command he already understood. Caleb touched the metal and felt cold leak through his glove. The ground answered his touch with a base tremor, faint as breath, through a wall, steady enough to be counted. He chipped around the handle until it freed, then twisted. Something inside caught. A ribbon of air slipped up, thin and metallic, with a whiff of ozone and wet penny. Gooseflesh raced his forearms. The low tremor strengthened, not loud, only present, a pressure he felt in his molars and behind his eyes. He set the spade as a lever, braced his boots, and pulled. The hatch hesitated, then lifted a fraction against a vacuum that had been waiting decades to exhale. A hiss became a whispering sigh. While he worked, the sky had turned brass. A dust wall advanced from the west, swallowing fences and pumps, reducing mountains to rumors. Wind struck the ridge like a flat hand and filled the air with grit. Sage hissed. The windmill screeched, then spun so fast it chattered. The storm's voice climbed from hiss to howl, and arrived at a stretched scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sand pelted his neck. The air tasted of chalk. The world shrank to Caleb. The dog, the ring of steel. He shoved harder. The hatch rose another inch and stuck. He changed position, pushed with his legs, felt the hinge moan through the lever. Cold fog coiled around his wrists, startling against baked skin. The tone below stayed precise and indifferent, repeating at regular intervals like a machine refusing to die. He counted without deciding to count, realizing the pulse matched the odd tremor he'd felt through the tracks when the blade first bit. Ranger's ears flicked with each beat, his body rigid, waiting. Lightning sheeted inside the dust, and threw the scene into black and white. Thunder followed, heavy and close, smothered by grit. Caleb imagined stairs below, a corridor, a room lined with dials, reels, a chair left at attention. He imagined a figure bending over a panel, pencil poised, listening to this same tone before sealing the lid. He imagined his father's hands. Old grief rose like groundwater under new fear. He steadied his breath and refused the spiral waiting to swallow it. He let the lid settle back the inch to rest, then palmed the metal again to feel the vibration confirm itself. It continued patient, methodical, almost aware. He brushed soil over the bright seam to dull it. The storm pressed closer, turning evening into an early thing, copper and thick. He dragged a tarp across the bulldozer's hood and anchored it with a chain. Ranger backed to heel, without prompting, leaning against his thigh as if volunteering to hold the line while decisions formed. He inventoried choices, while grit needled his fate. Force the hatch, and go down blind into a cold throat, humming like duty, or seal it and retreat, before the storm erased tracks and swallowed the ranch. He thought of Marlene Voss's letter, of empty troughs, of the bank's clock, of the dog's certain. He lowered the handle, covered the rim, and felt the tone carry on beneath them, as though nothing they did mattered yet. Ranger's gaze never left the place his paws had marked. They climbed into the truck. The cab muted the world to a tawny roar. Sand tapped the glass like rain with anger. Through the windshield, the mound became a darker smudge inside red haze, but Caleb saw the location perfect in his mind, sharp as a pin on a map. He rested his hand on Ranger's warmth, fed steadiness back into his breathing. 4 in, 4 hold, 8 out, until panic loosened its teeth, and the present came back. Outside, the wind howled like a scream that would not end. He stared into the storm, and let the new fact rewrite the day. A hatch stamped with a project name he had never heard, a date older than him, a warning that spoke in official steel, a pulse that kept time without care for weather or fear. The mound hadn't behaved like rock. It had behaved like a door. The dog hadn't panicked. He had pointed. Caleb felt the question rise with the same slow certainty as the tone below, and understood it demanded an answer before anything else moved. He tightened his grip on the wheel, tasted metal on his tongue, and felt the storm push the truck like a hand testing resolve. The dog's stare never blinked. Between the wind's scream and the buried heartbeat, a line drew itself through fear and debt and drought. He chose to listen before prying open a door built by silence alone. If your dog started digging like his life depended on it, would you trust him? Dawn thinned over the ridge like scraped metal. Caleb parked by the mound, killed the engine, and listened until he could hear the windmill's faint hinge and Ranger's steady breath behind him. The storm had glazed the clay into a fired skin, but the oval his dog clawed yesterday still marked the hill's crown. He brushed grit away and found the recessed handle, cold through the glove. He looped a safety line around his waist, set the pry bar, and drew dust into lungs trained to ration air. Ranger pressed against his thigh, ears forward, tail low, eyes unblinking. Caleb pulled. The handle resisted, then gave a fraction. The lid shifted against a stubborn seal that had clung to silence for decades. Air escaped with a dry, needling hiss, the long breath of a 60-year vacuum letting go. Smell followed. Ozone, solvent, old battery, a sterile sting that belonged to machines, not weather. The mix detonated memory. The desert fell away. He was back in Afghanistan, 2004, sliding into a limestone throat at dusk. Radio whispers riding his pulse. A wrong wire, a pressure plate, a muffled concussion. He tasted metal and chalk and could not find the next breath. Ranger barked once, sharp, commanding, then again lower, closer. A paw struck his knee. Fur brushed his knuckles. Caleb found the card's rhythm. 4 in, 4 hold, 8 out. He repeated it until grit returned to his tongue, and wind steadied. The cave loosened. The mound reappeared. He lifted with intent, and the lid rose another inch. Cold air slid over his wrists. His headlamp lit a shaft framed in riveted steel painted old military green. A ladder fell away into shadow. He tested the first rung, then the second, while the metal ticked awake. Ranger whined but did not try to follow. Caleb descended. Concrete received him. The room at the bottom looked preserved by time's indifference. A waist-high table bolted to the slab, shelves along one wall, a dead fan, a barred vent, a locker dented near the handle. Dust lay unmarked until his light drew circles through it. The odor held that sterile chemical note layered with cold. In the middle of the table something waited as if a hand had just set it down, and walked away. A leather logbook rested under the beam. The cover had crazed into fine cracks. A strap still buckled across its middle. He brushed a corner. 2 impressed letters surfaced. E.H. Eli Harlan. His father's hand lived in the shape of those strokes. Modest, square, precise. He unbuckled the strap and opened to a page preserved by dust. Ink had browned but endured. Lines marched in block handwriting that never begged to be liked. Next to the book sat a compact gray instrument with a carry handle and a wand clipped along its side. He flipped the latch. The Geiger counter woke, its needle twitching. then settling into delicate ticks, a far-off rain on tick. He moved the wand toward the vent. The rate ticked higher, then fell to a steady murmur. Not alarm, not nothing, simply proof that the room remembered. He scanned the shelves. A gray ammo can crouched on the lowest board. Stencil numbers almost ghosts. He worked the latch. The hinge croaked once. Inside lay 3 audio reels, in paper sleeves, labeled in the same hand as the log. Briefing, 4 Alpha, post-incident, statement, EH. He lifted the top reel. The tape threw dull copper into the headlamp. A river fossilized into a circle. A thumbprint ghosted the label's corner. Caleb returned to the logbook and read aloud because hearing would make believing irreversible. Procedure notes, inventories, power checks, then tone shifted. One paragraph opened like a cold door. Test 4 Alpha breached aquifer, recommending halt, relieved of duty. Silence afterward felt heavy enough to bend the table. He flipped backward. Early entries wore clipped optimism. Surveys, targets, tolerances. Project Eclipse crowned a margin. Then came delays, supply revisions. Queries answered with schedule talk. Red pencil said continue per directive. In the margin his father had written one word. Noted. The counter kept time, each tick measuring his breathing, not the room. He trained the beam across the perimeter. 2 stools, one draped with a folded coat that rustled like leaves. A calendar pinned to July 1965, edges crisp beneath dust. A thumbtack scar in the square for the 15th. A coffee ring, printed on steel. A sink with a mineral halo at the drain. A fuse box closed with 3 screws, one missing. Beneath all of it, a sub-audible thrum returned. The same bass pulse he had felt in the soil yesterday, regular as a metronome. He laid his palm to the table. The rhythm climbed into his bones. Whatever slept down here had chosen endurance over memory. He kept moving. He turned pages until he found the day the project swallowed its people. Hydrology concern escalated to Major Avery. Response limited to schedule. External notification protocol recommended. Outcome negative. Final line before tone changed. If leak confirmed, responsibility extends to water table. Wind murmured through the vent and cooled his face. The cave tried to return. Ranger barked above the hatch. 2 quick notes that brought him back. He packed with care, logbook into the pack, counter beside it, reels cushioned with a towel. A small brass key lay near the ladder foot. Dust softened except for a crescent where a boot had kissed it, decades ago. He pocketed it without a story. He climbed. Halfway he pressed his forehead to a rung so cold it shocked the last echo out. The counter ticked in the pack like a borrowed heart. He surfaced into wind, washed clean of last night's grit. Ranger pressed into him, then sat, eyes scanning the ridge. Caleb lowered the lid, until steel nearly touched steel, wedged a flat stone to keep a finger's gap, and brushed soil over the seam. They sat on the tailgate, and drank warm water. The sentence repeated behind his eyes until it felt carved there. He pictured calling Marlene Voss. He pictured 2 black SUVs at dusk, and men who knew his name from files he had never seen. He pictured his father sharpening a pencil. He considered sealing the hatch, burning the log, burying the reels, and pretending the dog had been wrong. Then he felt Ranger's chest rise and fall under his palm and knew denial would not buy a glass of water. Truth had woken. It would not go back to sleep. He set the pack beneath the seat, scanned the ridge, and watched a vulture ladder up a blue spiral. The counter ticked on. The reels waited. The logbook breathed through leather and dust. Caleb rested his hands on the wheel, feeling tremor turn into direction. He spoke into the cab's hush, to the room below, to the letter on his table, to the man whose initials lived in his pocket. Cloud shadow slid over the flats. A far train laid a thin horn across the base. He pictured the hatch shutting for good, and the truth rusting back into silence. Then pictured Ranger pawing at his knee until he moved. One vision felt like drowning, the other felt like air. Now, what would you do if the past you buried started digging back? Headlights skimmed the kitchen tile at 2 in the morning, sliding over the sink like cold fingers. Caleb paused. Ranger rose from the rug, ears high, eyes fixed on the door as engines faded. A door latched outside, measured, careful. Gravel answered with 3 neat crunches, then none. He killed the lamp and let darkness recover its shape. From the hallway window he saw 2 black SUVs by the windmill. Noses pointed out. One figure stood motionless, another traced a tight loop. impatience in his frame. Ranger pressed a shoulder to Caleb's leg. A reminder to breathe. Caleb set the chain, cracked the door, and waited. 3 polite knocks landed, precise as a metronome. He opened to the limit of the chain. 2 men stood in the cold. The front man carried gray hair cut close, a wool jacket and an unhurried focus. He raised a badge wallet at a respectful tilt. The partner, early 30s, jaw flexing, scanned corners as if trouble nested in hinges. Evening, the gray-haired man said in an official voice. Richard Vaughn, Bureau of Land Management Compliance. This is Mr. Kane. We had reports of heavy equipment near a protected feature. We'd like a quick walkthrough for safety. Caleb kept the chain taut. Protected feature? The mound on your north pasture, Vaughn said. Neighbors observed sparks, dust plumes. Could be cultural or geological concern. We'd rather verify before anyone gets hurt. Kane's eyes hooked on Ranger. Muzzle that dog. He's home, Caleb said. Ranger advanced a half step and planted, a low growl filling the doorway. No trouble intended, Vaughn went on. A glance at equipment serials, a look from the fence. 5 minutes. Got a warrant? Caleb asked. Kane smiled without humor. 2 a.m. emergencies don't wait on signatures. He shifted closer like a test. Ranger deepened his growl until the chain hummed. Kane stopped. Vaughn didn't flinch. We'll return at dawn, he said evenly. Keep doors locked. He took a brief inventory with his eyes and stepped back. They retreated without turning their backs, slid into the SUVs, and sat. Engines off, lights off, presents on. Caleb waited at the window while minutes collected. Ranger stood beside him, ears flicking at noises the human ear ignores. After 20 minutes, one SUV drifted away, down the track without lights. The other remained, a dark geometry etched into darker night. Caleb moved, speed without panic, purpose without noise. In the bedroom he pulled the cedar chest from under the window. The hinge sighed, releasing cedar and wool. He lifted quilts and nestled the leather logbook beneath them, slid the small brass key into the binding's crease, and laid a lake photograph on top. 2 figures and a shepherd catching sunlight. He closed the lid and pressed his palm to the wood as if sealing a vow. In the pantry he hauled a burlap feed sack to the floor, cut the twine and let corn pour like gold gravel. He set the gray ammo can, 3 reels inside, into the hollow packed grain around it, until the lid vanished, retied the mouth with the usual knot, dusted the sack with meal, and stacked it behind 2 others. He rolled a bale to block the view, then scuffed the floor to erase intention. Nothing looked staged. He returned to the sink, washed the empty cup, and let the clatter carry. He wanted the watcher to know he wasn't hiding. He turned deadbolts, checked windows, leaned the shotgun inside the bedroom door where it meant readiness, not threat, and sat on the couch in a spot that gave him the yard through a slit in the curtain. Ranger settled at his feet. Time length. The remaining SUV idled without engine. No exhaust, no vibration, only attention. Coyotes yipped beyond the wash, then stopped together. At 3:30, the vehicle slid away, choosing headlights only at the gate. Dust rose like a rumor and fell like a decision. Night resumed ordinary noises. A far truck, a barn creak, the house settling. Caleb stayed awake until a seam of gray opened along the eastern rim. He called Hank and let it ring once. Hung up. Called again. When Hank answered, his voice carried gravel. You get visitor? 2, Caleb said. Said, BLM, from the basin. Real? They lied like they'd practiced. Caleb said, want me to drive by? Just keep your eyes open, Caleb said. At first light he brewed coffee and set a stainless mug on the porch rail. He stacked tractor titles in a folder on the kitchen table, lined up a pen and wrote serial numbers on a notepad. Paper could masquerade as innocence, while truth breathed in cedar and corn. Ranger ate, drank and returned to station. By 8 the SUVs came back with sun on their hood. Doors opened and shut in a practiced rhythm. Vaughn reached the porch first, Kane trailing. The badge appeared at the same angle. Inspection, Vaughn said, mild as weather. You can stand right there, Caleb said. Ask your question. Ranger sat at heel. A quiet line across the doorway. Perimeter of the mound, Vaughn said. Bulldozer cereals, fuel storage. Any explosives on site? No explosives. Caleb said. Fuel's locked. The dozer is mine. Kane's glance slid into the room and back to the dog. Neighbors heard metal ring. You hit something. I hit dirt that fought back. Caleb said. You got papers? Vaughn smiled with practiced patience. We can get them. He rested a card on the rail. We prefer cooperation. I prefer day hours. Caleb said. Fence line only. They walked toward the north pasture. Caleb kept the kitchen and barn to his right. He felt Kane mapping angles. Vaughn asked for purchase dates and permit numbers from a list. Caleb answered with truths that wouldn't help them. They reached the fence. The mound lay in morning light, storm-glazed and unreadable. Wind moved a ribbon of grass, and left everything else blank. Caleb let his eyes rest on an ordinary patch of dirt that wasn't ordinary. Ranger stood at the post and stared without sound. Kane leaned into the wire, and listened like a man waiting for the ground to confess. Looks stable, Vaughn said. For now. His gaze returned to Caleb with a calm that pretended respect. If you plan more work, notify our office. I plan to fix a hinge. Caleb said. Back at the porch, the coffee steamed. Vaughn didn't touch it. We're in town all week, he said. If you remember anything else, anything that helps keep folks safe, call. He slid the card closer with 2 fingers. We appreciate cooperation. Kane paused on the step. Stare locked on Ranger. The dog met it without sound. Kane blinked first. They left, gravel hissing, sunlight washing away the night's shape. Caleb stood until the sound thinned. The cedar chest held a log with his father's initials, and a key in its crease. The burlap sack hid a gray can with voices wound on fragile tape. The house had become 2 houses, the one strangers inspected, and the one that kept faith. Ranger pressed against his leg. When they come for your secrets in the dark, who stands between you and the void? Morning light touched the far corner of the barn workshop. Caleb flipped on the single bulb and walked past the drill press. The vise, the coffee can of bolts his father had never thrown away. Ranger padded beside him, nails clicking on the concrete, nose sorting oil, hay and mouse. The Geiger counter waited on the bench, switched off yet insistent. A gray reminder that the hatch in the mound had been real. Beside it lay the leather logbook, strap buckled, as if keeping it closed could stop anything. Caleb reached past both toward a tarp in the shadowed corner. On the shelf above, his father's penciled label still clung to the wood, aka "Do Not Sell." He dragged the canvas down. Under it sat the reel-to-reel deck, chrome edges filmed with dust, meters blind behind glass. He remembered being 8. Listening to music leak out of that machine, while Eli Harlan planed boards. The tape hissed soft under the song. Now it just looked stubborn. Caleb traced the brand name with 1 finger, then set the ammo can beside it, and opened the latch. Paper sleeves crackled. He slid out the reel marked statement. The ink tight and controlled. His father's script. He threaded the tape onto the take-up spool. By muscle memory he had not realized still lived in his hands. Looped it past the heads, and locked it in place. Ranger watched from the doorway, ears sharp, as if he understood that whatever came next would change more than one life. The power switch clicked. Tubes woke with a faint orange glow. The motor spooled up, steady after all these years. Caleb turned the volume halfway, pressed play, and watched leader tape flash through. Then sound arrived, thin at first, then tightening into a voice he knew instantly and had never expected to hear again. Project Eclipse, personal record, Eli Harlan said. If you are hearing this, something went wrong with the official channels. The cadence was calm, but strain rode beneath it. Papers rustled close to the microphone. They're going to silence me. If it's sudden, it wasn't the heart. Caleb's throat closed. He grabbed the bench edge. The workshop shrank to the spinning reel. Memories he had filed away years ago kicked free. The late-night call from the hospital. The phrasing heart episode. The closed casket because he didn't look like himself. All of it reformed around that recorded sentence like filings around a magnet. The tape carried on. Test 4 Alpha breached aquifer. Radiation levels exceeded projections within 12 minutes. I recommended immediate halt and external notification. Command responded, by relieving me of duty, citing emotional involvement regarding civilian risk. Eli's breath caught once, then leveled. They will call it a natural failure. It will not be. The meters fluttered with each word, needles dancing in front of Caleb's pale reflection. Eli described cracked casings, rushed welds, orders to continue despite readings. An underground plume, drifting toward mapped wells. Names surfaced: Avery, Lucas, Vaughn. Phrases like national interest and plausible denial slid past in a flat tone that made them sound uglier. Caleb's vision tunneled. The barn blurred into a different concrete room, half collapsed, dust boiling through a shattered arch. He was back in Afghanistan, 2004, crouched behind a broken pillar while a medic worked on a kid whose vest had not quite done its job. Someone yelled for a tourniquet. Someone else shouted incoming. A concussion stole sound, then returned it as a thin whine. He smelled blood and burning insulation. The spinning reel became a rolling cloud of debris. Every tick of the capstan turned into an artillery countdown. Ranger barked once, then again. Close claws scrabbled on concrete. A heavy head slammed into Caleb's chest, knocking him back from the bench. Wet nose, hot breath, solid muscle anchored to his ribs. The dog's eyes locked onto his, pulling him forward through the narrowing tunnel. Caleb heard the therapist's instructions in his own voice. Slow breath. Find ground. Name what is real. He buried both hands in Ranger's coat, and felt the heartbeat under bone. He inhaled through his nose, until the workshop returned. Oil, sawdust, hay, the faint ozone tang from the old machine. The tape still ran. Eli's voice had dropped to a near whisper. If this reaches my boy, I hope he knows I tried. I signed my name under the objections. I filed them in triplicate. They changed the forms, not the outcome. Caleb hit stop with a shaking thumb. The reels coasted down. Silence settled, dense and charged. Murder, leak and cover-up did not need to be named. They lived in the paused tape like current in a buried line. He paced the bench length twice, anger rising in clean waves. His father had died alone, under fluorescent lights because he would not lie on a report. Men who had overruled him had gone home to promotions and obituaries. A widow had folded a flag in pretended belief. Caleb's fists closed until his knuckles cracked. For an instant he wanted to drive into town, find Vaughn, and slam the truth into his face, until something finally broke. Ranger intercepted him near the door, planting himself squarely in Caleb's path. The dog leaned his full weight forward, chest against his shins, forcing stillness. Amber eyes did not accuse. They simply held him there. Caleb sank onto an overturned crate. Ranger climbed over his boots, turned once, and settled with his head across Caleb's lap like a living anchor. Breath by breath, the rage cooled from white heat to something harder and more useful. Action instead of explosion. Evidence instead of impulse. He opened his eyes and looked at the Akai. The tape stopped with Eli's last words resting against the heads, waiting to be copied. The reels were not relics anymore. They were testimony. He wiped his face with his sleeve, reached for the old rotary phone, mounted on the barn post, and dialed a number buried in muscle memory. 2 rings, then a cautious hello. "Evelyn, it's Caleb Harlan," he said. "I need to ask about something from 65. There was a pause, then the sound of a lamp chain. "Your father's project," Evelyn Dorsey replied, fully awake now. Once the county library's keeper of microfilm, she had retired, but not forgotten what she had read. "I always wondered when this call would come." "I found his notes," Caleb said, "and a recording." She exhaled slowly. "Your father tried to stop it. Then he died suddenly. The obituary said heart issue. The internal memos said otherwise. In the way they avoided saying anything at all." Pages rustled on her end, as if she were already reaching for a folder. "Come by this afternoon. Bring whatever you have. It is past time someone listened to him properly." Ranger's tail thumped against Caleb's boot. The reel-to-reel waited, silent, but red. Outside, wind slid across the yard, carrying the faint hint of rain that might or might not arrive. The past had finally found its voice, and it sounded like Eli Harlan telling the truth to whoever dared press play. Night sat heavy on the ranch, windless and watchful. Caleb kept the logbook open, on the kitchen table. Eli's neat lines under the yellow lamp. The house felt full of unseen attention. Ranger dozed near the door, not quite asleep, ears lifting at every sound. A strange light brushed the window, the wrong color for moon or truck. Caleb stood and smelled it even before he stepped outside. Burning diesel and fresh flame. The barn was already a torch. Fire racing up the siding. Sparks blown into a ragged column of orange. Heat rolled across the yard like a shove. Ranger bolted past him with a sharp bark, circling wide. For a second all Caleb saw was the barn itself. The workbench, the Akai, the tools his father had arranged, dissolving into a wall of fire. Then headlights cut through the glow. A black SUV slid to a stop, between the house and the blaze. No siren, no decals. Kane jumped out before the engine settled. Pistol low, eyes bright with something that wasn't concern. Vaughn exited slower, shutting his door with a deliberate click, gaze taking in flame, house and man in one sweep. "Mr. Harlan," Vaughn called, voice calm over the roar. "Heard you had an accident." Caleb didn't answer. He grabbed the garden hose and opened the valve, sending a thin arc across the shingles to keep embers from nesting there. The barn's rear corner glowed hard. Diesel drums stacked nearby sweated and ticked as metal swelled. One seam burned with a skinny blue tongue. Someone had opened it. Kane peeled away from Vaughn, not toward the fire but toward the back door, using the blaze as distraction. Ranger saw it first. The dog cut across the yard at a dead sprint, and hit Kane just as the man reached the steps. Teeth found forearm through fabric, jaws locking with a wet thud. Kane's pistol went off, the shot chewing splinters from the door jamb instead of flesh. He howled and tried to wrench free. Ranger held on and shook. "Call him off," Kane yelled. "Drop the gun," Caleb snapped, though it already lay in the dust. Something flew from Kane's shredded pocket and skidded across the boards. A wallet flopped open under the flicker. An ID card stared up. Kane Mercer, Obsidian Risk Management. No mention of any federal agency. The lie from 2 a.m. burned almost hotter than the barn. Vaughn moved then, fast and precise, drawing his own weapon. He didn't aim at dog or rancher. He punched a single round into the air, the crack splitting the night. Ranger flinched, grip loosening just enough. Vaughn lunged in, grabbed Kane by the collar and yanked him sideways out of reach. At that instant, the overheated drum by the barn finally failed. The welded seam burst with a noise like the sky tearing. Fire and pressure leapt sideways. The blast slapped the air flat, then slammed it back into place. Light went white for a heartbeat. For Caleb, the world inverted. He was back on a dusty road in Afghanistan. Vehicle overturned, air thick with burnt rubber and cordite. Someone screaming his name through a failing radio. Vision tunneled. Sound shrank to a single whine, and his body locked. For 1.5 seconds he was a statue on his own porch, watching flame pour toward him in slow motion. Ranger hit him like a linebacker, shoulder to hip. The impact knocked him out of the flashback and off the step, dragging him clear as burning shingles and splinters hammered the spot where he had stood. He hit the dirt hard, lungs stunned, and sucked in a breath that tasted of ash and present tense. The barn's roof folded with a roar. Another drum cooked off, feeding the inferno. Caleb scrambled up, seized the hose again, swept it across the dry grass to keep the fire from jumping to the house. Ranger ran with him, positioning his body between the man and the worst of the falling debris, hackles high, eyes never leaving the two figures by the SUV. Vaughn half dragged, half shoved Kane toward the vehicle. Kane's arm hung twisted and slick, sleeve shredded, face chalk white under. "You lost control," Vaughn said softly. "We're not paid for loose ends." He shoved him into the back seat, slammed the door and looked back through the heat shimmer. "Old buildings, old wiring," he called, almost conversational. "Sometimes they just go. Best to let the past burn before it kills you." Then he was behind the wheel. The SUV rolled out of the yard without hurry, taillights shrinking against the orange sky. Sirens wailed far off, late and thin. Neighbors would see the glow and call in reports of a tragic fire, not a private war. By the time the volunteer engines arrived, the barn was a skeletal frame, ribs of glowing timber surrounded by a sea of embers. Men in yellow coats jumped down, dragged hoses, drowned what remained, and asked the usual question. Caleb kept his answers simple. Maybe a heater, Maybe old wiring. Maybe a spark he hadn't seen. Nobody had the energy to argue with a man who'd just watched his barn vanish. When the trucks pulled away, quiet returned in stages. The barn's carcass steamed, radiating heat into the cooling air. Caleb and Ranger walked the edge of what had been. Under the collapsed rafters, the Akai's shell lay twisted, reels melted into warped discs, wrenches had fused together in clumps. A clock that used to hang over the workbench lay face up in char, hands frozen at the moment the drum went. Time of death in cheap enamel. Ranger limped slightly, one pad nicked by shrapnel, but refused to leave his side. His loyalty held the fractured night together. Around Caleb, headlights approached again, slower, bouncing on the ruts. A dusty sedan rolled in and parked near the house. A lean young man climbed out, camera bag over one shoulder, hair pushed back by his fingers. As he took in the scene, "You Caleb?" he asked, voice low. "I'm Nate Dorsey, Evelyn's nephew. She said you might need a witness with a long memory and a short fuse for life." Caleb studied him, then nodded and motioned toward the kitchen. Inside he opened the cedar chest, lifted the quilts, and showed the logbook and Geiger counter. In the pantry, he cut the feed sack and revealed the gray ammo can sleeping in corn. Nate's eyebrows rose as he read labels, lips shaping the words Project Eclipse. "They torched your barn and still missed the real fire," Nate said. "We'll digitize these, get copies off-site. After that it won't matter how many buildings they light." Ranger sat between them, eyes moving from man to man, as if assigning trust. Caleb looked through the window at the smoking skeleton, then down at the reels and pages that carried his father's voice. Everything material he owned could burn. This, if shared, might survive him. He rested a hand on Ranger's neck, feeling the steady thump beneath fur, and spoke more to the room than to Nate. "In the fire," he said quietly, "what's worth saving?" 3 mornings after the barn fire, trouble changed shape again. At the co-op, Caleb tried to pay for feed and seed, but the clerk frowned at the screen. "Cards declined," he said softly. "Says your account is under federal review." The phrase tasted like metal. Ranger, sitting at his heel, sensed the shift, and rose. Back home, the bank's website showed every balance locked behind a red notice about unusual activity. There was a number to call. Before he could, his phone rang with an unknown ID. He answered anyway. "Mr. Harlan," Vaughn said, smooth, rested. "You have items from a restricted facility. Those items are now evidence. They will be returned." Caleb watched wind push ash around the black rectangle where the barn had stood. "All I see is a burned building and a frozen account," he replied. "Everything else belongs to my father's ghost." A shuffle scraped across the line. Then Evelyn Dorsey's voice arrived, thin but angry. "Caleb, don't you let them." A dull blow cut her off. "She is alive," Vaughn continued. "Whether she stays that way depends on your choices." Diablo Canyon, Overlook, 6 p.m. Originals, only tapes. Logbook, counter, no copies, no law enforcement. You will come alone. If we see anyone else, Miss Dorsey vanishes somewhere very deep. Caleb forced his voice flat. "She walks toward me first, or you get nothing." "You are in no position to bargain," Vaughn said, and hung up. 10 minutes later, Nate's dusty sedan turned into the yard. He took in Caleb's face, the dog's bristling posture, the half-loaded feed sacks. "What now?" he asked. "They froze the money," Caleb said. "They took Evelyn. They want everything at the canyon by sundown." Nate swore under his breath, then dropped his camera bag on the table. "So they plan to erase every witness in one place, and call it a misunderstanding." He opened the laptop inside the bag. "Then we make sure every second is recorded, and the real proof never leaves this land." They drew the curtains and laid the evidence out. Eli's logbook, the reels in their gray can, the Geiger counter. The digital copies already lived on Nate's drives and in cloud storage, but the originals had weight. Caleb fetched an old ammo box from the closet. Same dimensions, scarred but sound. "We give them a box," he said. "Just not this one." Together they built a twin. In the decoy they packed blank tape wound on empty cores, rusted bolts, and lead sinkers, until it matched the reel can's heft. Nate relabeled the reels in careful block letters that mimicked Eli's hand at a glance. From across the room, Even Caleb had to lean close to see the difference. The true can went into a waterproof liner, and then a feed sack. Behind the house, Caleb dug until the shovel hit firmer clay. 5 feet down, the soil turned cool. He lowered the sack, covered it, tamped the surface. Ranger sat beside the filled hole, and sniffed once, as if memorizing the place. They still needed someone with a badge. Nate called Trooper Carver, the only lawman Evelyn trusted. On a quiet county road, Carver listened while Nate played Eli's voice, then showed him nighttime photos of the hatch and screenshots of log pages. Silence stretched long enough for doubt, then broke. "I can respond to kidnapping, illegal weapons and hazardous waste," Carver said. "I'll bring state units into Diablo on a public safety complaint, but if you want this to stick, I need the confrontation on camera, clean." "You'll have it," Nate replied. "You come from one side, I'll be on a ridge with a lens." Caleb goes to the meeting, and acts like he believes their rules. Late afternoon found the truck heading north, bed empty, cab carrying 1 man 1 dog, and 1 lot. Caleb had tightened Ranger's harness, and coaxed him into the footwell, where the shepherd curled beneath the dash, hidden by shadow. The decoy can rode on the seat, its handle looped with a strap. The sky over the mesa had gone brass. Diablo Canyon waited ahead like a At the overlook turnout, a black SUV sat with its rear almost hanging over the drop. Vaughn leaned on the rail, jacket off, sleeves rolled. Kane, arm locked in a rigid brace, watched from the bumper with a stare that tried to be hard and mostly looked tired. A second vehicle idled farther back, glass blacked out. "You're prompt," Vaughn said. "That will help everyone." "You said 6, Caleb answered, lifting the can. "I learned to follow orders in places you send other people's kids." "Set it down," Kane snapped. "Step away." Caleb placed the box on the rock between them and backed off, palms open. On a ledge above, Nate lay flat behind a boulder, camera aimed, finger resting near the record button. Beyond him, tucked in folds of stone, unmarked state vehicles waited for Carver's call. A rear door on the second SUV opened. Evelyn stepped out, wrists bound, hair wild, jaw set. A guard walked her toward the rail. Her eyes met Caleb's briefly, clear and furious. "Proof of life," Vaughn said. "Now the exchange." "Cut her loose first," Caleb replied. "Then you can weigh all the scrap iron you like." Kane moved before Vaughn could answer. Hungry for his own victory, he strode to the can and flipped the latch. That movement was the signal. Caleb whistled once. Low. Ranger shot from the truck like a projectile, nails scrabbling on gravel. He slammed into Kane's chest, teeth closing on the man's good arm this time, dragging him away from the can and down. Kane's shout ricocheted off the canyon walls. Vaughn went for his pistol. Caleb closed the gap in 3 strides, and drove a shoulder into his ribs, jamming the older man against the fender. The gun hand clipped metal. The weapon skittered under the SUV. Vaughn clawed for Caleb's throat. Caleb pivoted, torqued his wrist, and forced him to one knee. "State police." Carver's voice thundered from the rim. Light strobed blue and red as hidden cruisers spilled out from behind rock outcrops. Troopers fanned along the edge, rifles leveled, hands where we can see them. "Step away from the woman and the dog." The guard on Evelyn froze, fingers loosening from her elbow. She jerked free and ran toward Caleb, stumbling once, then righting herself. Ranger released Kane at a single word and backed toward her, body between hostages and SUVs, lips peeled but silent. Officers surged onto the overlook. Zip ties snapped around wrists. One trooper hauled the decoy can open, exposing bolts and dead tape. His raised eyebrow and the tiny huff of amusement were caught on multiple body cameras. On the ridge, Nate rolled his camera, capturing Vaughn's expression as the trap closed. "You have no idea who you're crossing," Vaughn hissed while they pinned his arms. "This will not stand." "You buried a radioactive leak and a good man with it," Caleb said. "It has been standing too long." By sunrise, Nate's first cut of the canyon video had gone live alongside segments of Eli's recordings. His small paper's site crashed under the load. Larger outlets mirrored the file. Viewers watched a gray-haired engineer, warn about Test 4 Alpha, then watched his son confront the men who kept that warning hidden. Ranger's tackle of Kane played on an endless loop between interviews about groundwater and donations began trickling, then pouring into a fundraiser someone launched for the veteran whose barn they burned. Comment sections filled with messages, from people who had lost family, to cancers near forgotten test sites, and from others who just wanted to help rebuild a roof for a man and his dog. The bank called next. Marlene Voss herself came on the line, voice now honey. There appears to have been an overcautious federal hold, she said. Your account is fully restored, Mr. Harlan. Given the circumstances, our institution would be happy to assist with reconstruction financing and media inquiry. I think the public has it handled, Caleb answered, and ended the call. Weeks later, federal trucks appeared at the mound. Workers in white suits erected fencing, drove pilings, and poured pale concrete over the hatch, until the hill became a blunt gray dome. Officials held a short press conference. Microphones recorded phrases like archived program, limited incident, and precautionary encapsulation. No one said Eli Harlan's name. Before the first mixer turned, Caleb and Nate had walked to a spot outside the marked perimeter, measured off a few paces from a mesquite stump, and dug one more careful hole. Into it they lowered a narrow tube, containing the original logbook, the reels, and a note in Caleb's hand, explaining their history. They sealed it, buried it, and walked away. Digital copies were already scattered across servers on 3 continents. The tube simply gave the truth weight in the home. One evening, after the crews left and the new dome stood alone, under a bloody sunset, Caleb climbed the low rise above it with Ranger. Concrete glowed dull where the humming mound had once lived. Beyond it, the desert stretched toward purple mountains. Ranger stopped at the crest, sniffed the wind, and leaned his shoulder into Caleb's leg. They turned back toward the house, boot treads and paw prints cutting side by side through soft sand. Behind them, the sealed program slept under its man-made cage. Ahead of them, the story kept moving, carried by recordings, articles, and the people who had decided it mattered. The government had buried a project. A dog and a stubborn son had kept the truth above ground. The deepest secrets are rarely buried in concrete chambers or behind stamped steel. They stay alive in the memories of stubborn hearts, in dogs who refuse to stop digging, and in families who refuse to pretend a lie is the same thing as peace. For 60 years, a forgotten hatch slept under a sun-burned ranch, while official reports called a disaster contained and a murdered engineer. Unfortunate. It should have stayed invisible. It should have rusted back into dust. Instead, one battered veteran pointed a bulldozer at an ancient termite mound, and a German shepherd named Ranger decided the past had slept long enough. You have just walked every step of that path with Caleb Harlan. You watched a desperate rancher try to save his dying land, only to find out his biggest enemy wasn't drought or debt, but a classified program stamped Project Eclipse. You saw Ranger, the dog trained to pull Caleb out of panic, slam himself between steel and earth like a living roadblock, digging at one exact spot until his paws hit metal. That simple act of instinct ripped the lid off a cover-up. Powerful men believed they had welded shut forever. Under that mound was not treasure, not gold, not even water, but a hatch humming with a pulse that never stopped counting the years. Down in that buried room you heard a dead man's voice come back to life. Eli Harlan, the father they said died of heart trouble, speaking straight into a tape recorder, warning about a radioactive leak, pleading for the tests to stop, predicting the way they would silence him and change the story on paper. That wasn't just exposition. That was a ghost finally getting a chance to testify. Decades too late for himself, but just in time for the son who never stopped wondering what really happened in night. Ranger didn't understand the politics, the science, or the paperwork. He understood something older and purer, that his human was in danger from something nobody else wanted to see. Then the pressure closed in. Midnight visitors in unmarked SUVs stood on Caleb's porch pretending to be from the Bureau of Land Management, while their IDs whispered another name, Obsidian Risk Management, a private outfit hired to erase problems, not solve them. Someone torched the barn as a distraction, hoping flame and chaos would swallow evidence. Instead, Ranger launched himself at Kane, teeth buried in the man's arm, tearing loose a wallet that told the truth better than any badge ever could. A diesel drum exploded. Caleb froze in a flashback that almost killed him, and that same dog dragged him bodily out of the kill zone. On paper, Ranger is a service animal. In reality, He is a one-dog rescue squad, bodyguard and moral compass. And still, the story could have died there if fear had won. But you saw what happened next. A retired librarian, who never forgot the patterns she saw in dusty government documents. A young reporter with more stubbornness than resource. A state trooper willing to listen to an old tape instead of an easy excuse. Together they helped turn one isolated ranch into the epicenter of a truth earthquake that shook boardrooms and quiet offices far from the New Mexico dust. The Canyon Showdown at Diablo wasn't some Hollywood finale. It was the moment three ordinary people and one extraordinary dog decided enough was enough, and forced the shadows into daylight while cameras rolled and sirens closed in. Ranger did far more than save Caleb's pulse during panic attack. He stood between his handler and armed intruders. He turned his body into a shield against shrapnel and collapsing timber. He became living proof that loyalty, when it refuses to bend, can crack a system built on silence. Even after the government poured concrete over the hatch and stamped the whole thing as an archived program, that dog kept pacing the fence line, reminding Caleb that concrete is only a lid, not an eraser. The real archive lives in people who refuse to forget. If this journey through loyalty, betrayal and a 60-year lie hit you in the chest, this is your invitation to stay. Tap subscribe, ring the bell, and become part of this community that hunts for the stories they tried to bury under jargon, security stamps and time. Here we dig into the kind of tales that almost vanished, whistleblowers nobody believed, experiments that went wrong in the dark, small towns living with consequences they never agreed to. When you watch, like, and share, you are not just helping a channel's number. You are helping voices like Eli Harlan's travel farther than any secret memo ever could. Now I want to hear from you. In the comments, tell us honestly, what would you have done the moment your own dog started clawing at the earth like his life depended on it? Would you have shut off the engine, grabbed a shovel, and trusted those paws? Or would you have written it off as nerves and driven forward, crushing the signal the universe was sending you? There is no easy answer, but your gut reaction says a lot about the kind of person you are. Share. Someone else reading your words might find the courage to listen to their own instincts the next time something in their life starts digging in a way that doesn't make sense yet. And tell us where you are watching from. Are you sitting in a city apartment miles away from any desert? Or out on your own patch of land listening to your own wind in your own quiet at night? Is there a legend in your town about a factory accident, a contaminated creek, a neighbor who died under unclear circumstances that everyone stopped talking about even though nobody really believed the official story? Drop those rumors, those fragments, those half-finished sentences. This channel exists because ordinary people send us the threads that powerful people hope will stay tangled. Remember, the deepest secrets are not guarded by concrete, fences, or cold steel. They are guarded by the fear that nobody will care if the truth finally crawls into daylight. But you cared enough to stay to the end of this story. That already makes you part of something bigger than one video. One buried truth has already surfaced. A father's warning, a son's determination, and a dog's refusal to back down. The next hidden story is already waiting, just off screen, scratching at the edge of the map. Click on the episode you see on your screen right now, and keep walking with us into the places where silence finally runs out, and the truth, no matter how long it slept, gets its turn to breathe. Before you go, take a second to look around your own life and history, the stories your grandparents hinted at but never fully explained, the strange gaps in documents, the locked drawers, the fenced-off lots, the taped-over names in yearbooks, and ask yourself whether one of those threads is quietly waiting to be pulled, because if it is, you might be the one truth is choosing.